Hey, this is Dina. Welcome to the den. Okay, before I get to the meat of this video, I better address the elephant in the room. I'm not sure why people would even want it at this point, but up until pretty recently I've been getting a lot of requests to do some kind of in-depth video about the Silent Hill quote-unquote playable teaser, or Silent Hills, the game that was going to be the next Silent Hill sequel that everyone was excited about, me included, until Konami cancelled it. I was never going to make a video about it before the finished game came out. For one thing, I don't even have a PS4, so I never even got a chance to play it for myself. And now that it's been taken down, I never will. I suppose I could have done some kind of commentary over someone else's playthrough of the teaser, but that would be kind of disingenuous since I didn't really experience it per se, I just watched someone else do it.
The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you?
Also, again, the game has been cancelled. It sucks to be sure, and like the rest of you, I sure wish it wasn't, but I just kind of want to move on rather than dwell on it. So yeah, the most I can say about Silent Hills is that it looked amazing and I would like to have played it. If you're still interested in speculation about symbolism and story elements that it may have been hinting at, I recommend reading the TV Tropes page. There's actually a lot of that on there. We'll never know for sure if it's accurate, but whoever wrote this obviously put a lot of thought into it, and it's definitely worth a read. And I guess I can't go without also mentioning what's happening with Konami. When they cancelled Silent Hills, they mentioned that the Silent Hill series would continue in the same breath as mentioning they were veering away from video game production. Sounds like a contradiction. But then a commercial for the next Silent Hill game came out, which looked to be some kind of sequel or reimagining of Silent Hill 2. Ha! Just kidding. It's a Silent Hill 2 themed pachinko machine, suckers. Hit
the lever!
I'm sure we'd all like to hit the lever on Konami right about now.
Why do we even have that lever?
But yeah, that's all I have to say about that, other than it's not the best time to be a Silent Hill fan. I could rant about Konami and their horrible business practices and the firing of Hideo Kojima, but a lot of other video producers have done that already, and probably better than I ever could. I'll just say fuck Konami and leave it at that. Now that that's all out of the way, let's go back to a happier time. This is actually not the first video I've ever done on the original Silent Hill. Back in the days when I was just doing guest reviews for Still Gaming, I did one for Silent Hill. I was originally going to leave it at that, but eventually I decided to revisit it and give it similar attention as I've given the sequels. But I can't talk about how I discovered Silent Hill without talking about Resident Evil. Resident Evil was my introduction to survival horror, and I had never played anything like it until a friend introduced me to the Sega Saturn version of it, even though I'm clearly showing the PlayStation version here. Remember, I grew up on the Atari 2600, and continued playing video games throughout the reign of Nintendo and Sega. During the time when I was just getting into horror movies and Stephen King novels, there weren't really any horror games to speak of. I know now that there were horror PC games, and the first Clock Tower game was on Super Famicom, but I didn't have access to things like that then. And I think the Genesis version of Splatterhouse somehow flew under my radar. Even just seeing blood in a game was a rare treat for me back then. And even though my interest in fighting games ended up not lasting very long, you gotta know that I jumped on Mortal Kombat pretty quick, as I've talked about in an earlier video. It was the closest thing I had to a horror game for a while. But Resident Evil was a lot of fun. It felt like a zombie or monster movie. Most of the scares were either jump scares, or squick, and it's notorious for its cheesy dialogue and voice acting.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Even I'm guilty of making fun of it.
You guys are idiots.
That's the line of the game right there. You guys are idiots.
But the graphics were beautiful for its time. It had a creepy, foreboding soundtrack and overall dark atmosphere. It basically achieved what it set out to do. But then the same friend told me about Silent Hill for the PlayStation, telling me that it was even scarier than Resident Evil. I played it, and the rest, as they say, is history. You play as Harry Mason, who has just been in a car accident on his way through a small town called Silent Hill. And that's at least the third time I've said that phrase in a video. He wakes up to find his 7-year-old daughter, Cheryl, missing, and the town appears to be completely deserted, other than a cop named Sybil Bennett and lots of monsters. And he meets a few other interesting characters on the way as he goes to hell and back to find his daughter, and a mystery slowly unravels itself. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty much run-of-the-mill survival horror. There are guns and various melee weapons. The gameplay is pretty straightforward. Despite being of the same genre, Silent Hill is a very different experience than Resident Evil. Instead of playing as a Special Forces officer, you play as basically just an average Joe, with very bad aim. Knowing what I now know about Team Silent, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that that was probably intentional, since realistically, Harry's probably never fired a gun before. There are no bazookas or flamethrowers in this game, not that you don't get some nice weapons. The hunting rifle is probably the most powerful, just nothing of this caliber. It's not as pretty as Resident Evil, mostly because Resident Evil had pre-rendered backgrounds, while with Silent Hill the rendering is in real time, so graphics look more dated. That doesn't really matter though, the ambiance more than makes up for it, and the design is great even if the graphics don't support it as well as they could have. I think if anything it works in its favor. Silent Hill isn't supposed to be pretty, and I feel like the dated graphics help to make it even more gritty somehow. I actually find the first Silent Hill game to have the creepiest and most disturbing atmosphere overall, and I think that might be why. While Silent Hill being cerebral is kind of a given now, at the time, it was the first game I had ever played that really messed with my head.
I don't remember this being here before.
It introduced the concept of the Otherworld. Which became such a Silent Hill staple that I didn't even bother mentioning it when talking about the sequels.
Oh, hell.
I guess I just thought it was a given. Except I did bring it up when I talked about Origins, because that game lets you switch between worlds at will, which I didn't agree with. The only game to not use the Otherworld concept is Silent Hill 4, as it was trying some new things, and instead of switching suddenly to the Otherworld and back again at different points throughout the game, it was more like the world gradually became the Otherworld the further you went into Walter Sullivan's subconscious. Which was an interesting way to do it, if not as Silent Hill-like. But in the first game, it packs such a punch. You think you're nearly done with an area, then suddenly you have to do it all over again in a much darker, more oppressive, and more intimidating environment with scarier monsters. In fact, the first game played up the idea of the worlds being alternate versions of each other in one scene that just totally blew my mind when I first played it. In the locker room at the school, one locker is rattling. You go to open it, and it turns out to be a cliché cat scare. After it shifts to the other world and you go back to that room, the locker is rattling again. But when you open it, it's empty other than being full of blood. And just as you're shaking your head, wondering if the cat exploded or something, and how it even got back in there to begin with, you're hit with a jump scare coming from somewhere else in the room. That whole aspect of repetition just really messed with my head. That weird feeling of deja vu with just enough differences to put you off is like something out of a nightmare. I'm not sure how to even explain it, but I think it's brilliant. And even though jump scares are overused these days, this one is so well timed and effective that it's actually a nice touch. Another thing that sets Silent Hill apart from Resident Evil is that it had lots of symbolism. You don't really need to know the symbolism to understand this particular story, as it's less complex than the other games, but it really helps to flesh things out. But Silent Hill does have one thing in common with Resident Evil: bad voice acting and dialogue.
Radio. What's going on with that radio?
What? What is this?
Although it's bad in a different way. While Resident Evil characters have this weird fake urgency going on in their speech, which kind of makes them sound like hyper kids.
Jill, you're here too.
Yes, you're here too?
We're all here! Silent Hill is almost the opposite, where there's too little emotion and urgency.
You from around here? Why don't you tell me what happened?
I don't mind it, actually. If anything, it gives an understated, creepy vibe, which I don't dislike. But there are lots of pauses in the speech.
I just got here. I don't know what happened.
Some of it obviously added in post-production, and that's kind of distracting.
For the 7 years since that terrible day, Alessa has been kept alive.
I think it might be a programming issue. Also, I don't think the voice acting is necessarily bad. It doesn't have that "I'm acting" feel to it.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
So much as the emotions the characters are trying to convey don't always work with what's going on in the scene, so that could be chalked up to bad direction. I mean, take the scene from the bad ending. It's technically a spoiler, but I'm showing it without context, and it's non-canon with Silent Hill 3 anyway. Harry is basically seeing his 7-year-old daughter die in front of him. And how does he react?
Cheryl?
Cheryl?
Cheryl!
Either way, this line just totally kills me.
Half the soul is lost. That is why the seed lies dormant.
The seed lies dormant. One good thing about Origins is that they took that scene and kept the dialogue intact, but it had better voice acting.
Half the soul is lost. The seed lies dormant.
But yeah, that's the only legitimate bad thing I have to say about Silent Hill. And I'm sure it has to do with the fact that the script was originally written by Japanese speakers and it got translated back and forth between Japanese and English a few times. I wouldn't care, except that it also resulted in the story being really hard to follow even as Silent Hill games go. To this day, I don't understand half of what Dahlia is talking about.
The path of the hermit concealed by flowers.
What? What are you talking about?
But anyway, I do definitely recommend this game, however dated it may look. In part 2, I'll talk more about the story and characters. As always, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't played the game yet,
Still time!
I am gonna miss you, Johnny Smith. Anyway, I recommend playing it before coming back for the next segments.